Why did TSR replace the Moldvay Marsh version of Basic D&D just 2 years after releasing it? We're going to talk about TSR business drama, rejected art, and the promise of high-level play with the BECMI version of D&D today on Daddy Rolled a One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. Today, we're going to be talking about the BECMI edition of Dungeons & Dragons, which covers 5 different box sets, which is where this edition gets its name. It's an abbreviation for Basic, Expert, Companion, Masters, and Immortals. BECMI or BECMI edition, which is what we call it kind of retroactively in hindsight now. It wasn't in common use at the time when this was published, but it was first published in 1983 through 1986, which was when the last box set, the Immortals set, was published. And I'm guessing from the majority of the people who watch my channel that a lot of you might have started playing with this edition. It was reported that it is the single biggest selling edition of Dungeons & Dragons, at least during the TSR era. So that would cover from 1974 through 1997, at which point TSR was acquired by Wizards of the Coast. And part of that reason is because, of course, there are 5 box sets to this. So that was generating more and more sales for this particular edition. But even so, what's commonly known as the red box of the edition, which is the basic set, that edition alone, or that set alone, that box set, is in the top 5 of all TSR products sold. It barely makes the top 5, but it's in there at over 1.1 million units sold just for the basic set. So to put that in perspective, the player's handbook for advanced Dungeons & Dragons sold a total of 1.5 million units. Now, I don't know for sure if that 1.5 million units includes the revised cover, the Easily cover, or whether that's just for the Trampier cover. I think it's both. I think it's just the entire history of the Player's Handbook, 1.5 million books sold. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about sales more as we get into this, but my point is that this is a huge edition of Dungeons & Dragons, and it marks another shift and change in the way that TSR is going to be marketing the materials and their products to the general public. And what's interesting, really, I think, is that this version of the game comes just 2 years after the Moldvay Basic Cook or BX version of the game, that box set. And we're going to talk about why that was, why there was only 2 years of time difference between the two. So a couple things that I want to mention just in terms of how I'm naming these products when I talk about them so that you don't get confused, make sure that we're all on the same page. When I talk about in this video, and this is going to be pretty consistent also for other videos on the channel, when I'm talking about the original Dungeons & Dragons game that came out, the little 3 little brown books, the 3 pamphlet books, digest size, I'm going to call that original D&D. Sometimes you'll hear me say white box. If you hear that, this is what I'm talking about, is this version of Dungeons & Dragons from 1974. And that includes the supplements that were created for it, okay? When I'm talking about this version of D&D, which is the Holmes Basic set, I'm just going to call it Holmes Basic. Okay, so that is to distinguish it from the other 2 basic versions of the game that we have, one of which is this version that I started with, this magenta box. This is the Moldvay Marsh edition. I'm going to refer to this mostly as BX, although every once in a while you hear me call it Moldvay or Moldvay Marsh. All of those are correct, and that's what I'm talking about when I talk about this version of the game, which includes this expert set underneath, okay? And then when I'm talking about the version that we're going to be talking about today, I'm going to call it BECMI. So it was edited by Frank Mentzer, and my understanding is that Frank prefers that people, Frank is still with us, and he prefers that people call it BECMI, not Mentzer Basic, which it has been used in the past. Sometimes you'll also hear me say red box. If I say red box, I'm speaking specifically of the basic set for the BECMI version of the game. So I'm just trying to keep everyone, like I said, aligned here on the same page. And then when I'm talking about Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, if I say Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, I'm talking about what people would now call 1E. I'm not including the second edition part of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. That I will specifically call out as second edition. That probably shouldn't come up in this video, but I just wanted to make sure that we're clear. So when I'm talking about these things, I know it can get confusing going back and forth with all these names. So if you do need a refresher on that, and or maybe you're new to discovering this and you weren't aware that all these different editions existed, just check out my video on the history of Dungeons and Dragons editions. It's one of the earliest videos on my channel, so it is a little rough in terms of the editing and the presentation, but in about 20 minutes, I take you through every edition of Dungeons and Dragons that had been published up until the point that I made the video, which was in like in the spring of 2023. Okay, so in today's video, we are going to be talking about, first off, why there was a quote unquote basic version of Dungeons and Dragons that helped get us to why specifically the BECMI version of Basic. So these three versions, the Holmes Basic, the Moldvay Marsh Basic, and the BECMI Basic version of the game, or those versions of the game, my friends and I all called that back in the day. We called that as a collective term, Basic D&D, by which we meant it was not part of Advanced D&D. Okay, so that's why we called it Basic D&D. As you see here, it just says Dungeons and Dragons. There is this little tag here that says Basic Set, but see, this one says Expert. We just called all of this collectively Basic, and that was, again, to distinguish it from Advanced, okay? But I am going to talk about why there was a basic version of the game created anyway that ran concurrently, like alongside Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, because it's important to understand why that basic edition exists, because that does factor into why the BECMI version of the game was created, revising the Moldvay version just 2 years after Moldvay came out. We're going to talk about what was going on at the company, at TSR, what was going on in the hobby gaming industry in general. Also a little bit about like economics and sort of like the world and you know, the United States, what was happening at that time that led to the creation of the BECMI version of the game. And then I'm going to talk about the differences between the BECMI version of the game and the Moldvay Marsh version of the game. These two, BECMI and BX, are very close, but there are differences. And I'm going to break out what those differences are. And those differences are mostly going to focus on the first two box sets of BECMI, the Basic and Expert set, because BX only has Basic and Expert. So Basic covering levels 1 through 3 and Expert covering levels 4 through 14. Well, there are similar box sets for the BECMI edition that do the exact same thing in terms of levels. And then the real differences are going to come in when we talk about what's introduced, what's new with the Companion, Masters, and Immortals sets. Now, unfortunately, I don't own any of the BECMI versions in physical like hard copies, except for this Dungeon Masters rulebook from the BECMI edition that my friend gave me. I don't even have the player's rulebook from that system. So when we get to that point, we will be I'll be looking at PDFs on my laptop, and we'll go through them that way. So this is intended mostly to focus on the history of why this edition exists, and then also some of the mechanical changes, but I'm not going to get into the weeds on every edition because or every box set, because there are 5 of them, and the video already, I can tell, is going to be very long. Okay, so if that all sounds interesting to you, something that you would like to learn about, and you think it's going to be informative and entertaining, then please take a few seconds to like the video, double check to make sure that you're subscribed to my channel, and then make sure that you're adjusting the settings on that bell icon so that YouTube will notify you when I upload a new video. All those things really help my channel, but also any channel that you enjoy. I would suggest just do that. Just even subscribing to channels where you like their videos really helps those channels. Okay, so let's dive in and talk about, firstly, this is going to be as brief as I can make it, but why was there a basic edition of Dungeons and Dragons, or a non-advanced version, like 2 different versions of the game being published? Well, we've covered a little bit of this before, but this is for people that are new to the channel. Original Dungeons & Dragons, of course, is published in 1974, and it has 3 books. But then over the next 2 years, they add a total of 4 more supplements to the game. So there are more supplements for original D&D than there are actual rule books to begin with. Okay. And those supplements are adding new classes and races and spells and monsters and treasures and mechanics. Okay. And what was unique about these supplements at the time was that they weren't revising and replacing rules. They were adding to them. That's where they're called supplements. They're supplementing the original rules. And it was presented mostly as optional, but most people at that time took it to they grabbed onto it because they were eager for more content. This system of original D&D is extremely flexible. There are a lot of gaps in the rules, and it is designed specifically to be open, to be interpreted by what they called the referee or the judge. The term dungeon master wasn't being used back then. So that makes it a little bit difficult to teach people who are trying to learn just from reading this. And I've talked about this before. Yes, you can try to learn how to play original D&D from reading the books. I know people have done it, but it's not easy. And so in 1977, TSR is going to publish the Holmes Basic version of Dungeons and Dragons. This is edited by Professor J. Eric Holmes, who approached TSR. He was a California gamer, specifically aligned with like the Caltech group out here in Pasadena, where I live. And he approached, again, the folks at TSR with the idea of writing an introductory set of rules to original D&D to make it easier to understand how to play for new novice players who did not have wargaming backgrounds, also younger players. So he wrote this version of the game, the Holmes Basic version of the game. Now, this only covers levels 1 through 3, and originally it directed you that if you wanted to keep playing at levels 4 and above, to go back to original D&D. Well, the folks at TSR at the time realized that was kind of a mistake, because going backward, they didn't want to go backwards. If you go backwards to original D&D, you're back in that same problem that you have where that the presentation of the rules in this is very, very kind of scattershot all over the place and difficult to follow. And if you have this introductory set that's trying to bring new people into the game, you don't want to send them backward to something that wasn't necessarily written and organized and laid out with the standards that they were working with at the time. Now, simultaneously to this, and as early as 1976, Gary Gygax realizes that part of the flaw of having an open system, which I really like, I think it's a feature, and a lot of people think it's a feature, that it is so open and flexible. But the downside of that is that it doesn't work with the tournament style convention play that was happening at the time, where you have teams of players competing in tournament adventures for points to win prizes. Because this system is so flexible, that means each individual judge is adjudicating differently and making up rulings on the fly to account for the decisions that players are making that aren't explained in this set of rules, this original set of rules. And so that would mean that you could have two different groups of players approach a problem in a dungeon the same way, but two different judges might allocate the points differently or might make a ruling differently based on what they interpreted the rules to say in here. And so Gary realized that that was going to be a problem. And in order to have more consistency, he starts coming up with the idea of writing a set of rules that is going to basically proactively answer any question that a player could come up with. Now, that's the goal of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I think it's an impossible goal because you could never anticipate what every player everywhere is going to ask. You can anticipate most of them, but there's always going to be something in there. But anyway, that was part of the goal for making Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So Gary starts working on this with Tim Kask in 1976 while Professor Holmes is editing the basic set. And so then kind of the light bulb goes off and the folks at TSR realize instead of having the Holmes basic set for levels 1 through 3, direct people back to play the older version of the game, the original version, why not direct them over to play Advanced D&D? Now, that's not why Holmes was written, but it does, by the time it hits stores and is published, acts as an introduction set to Advanced D&D. Okay, so that was the original version of why this basic set existed. Now, what happened was, again, the folks at TSR, and this was reported by Stephen Marsh, who's going to work on the expert set that coming up in 1981. Okay, but Steve Marsh says that the folks at TSR, the thought at the time was that people were going to start with basic, like if they're brand new to the game, they're going to start with the basic set from Holmes, and then they're going to migrate over to Advanced D&D because that just seems natural. Why wouldn't you do that? Well, part of the issue is that, again, Holmes, when I say this, and I'm trying to be clear for people who are watching and not, or who are listening and not watching, the Holmes set was not really written to be an introduction to advanced D&D. So there are contradictions. There are rules in Holmes that are not in advanced D&D. There are also rules in Holmes that are not in basic D&D because Professor Holmes was trying to, again, figure out how to teach this to new players to play the game. And so there were things that are not even addressed, such as initiative in original D&D that Professor Holmes had to make a rule for. Well, that rule that he made up is not the one that was in advanced D&D. So you have this kind of hybrid system in Holmes, but it is closer in DNA, I would say, to the original D&D than it is to advanced, even though in Holmes it does direct you to play advanced. The mechanically, Holmes is much closer to original D&D. Okay, so what happened was two things that were sort of a surprise. One was that new players to the game, a lot of them bypassed the Holmes Basic set completely and went straight to advanced D&D. And they did that because they were like, well, why would we want something that doesn't have all the rules in it? Why don't we just get the thing that has all the rules that we need? So we'll go to the advanced and we'll just skip over the thing that just has part of the rules. And we'll go to the thing that has everything because we're new. And so we should have all the rules so that we can understand how to play the game. So that was part of it that the folks at TSR didn't anticipate. Okay. The other thing was that players who had started with original D&D, a lot of them didn't want to make the shift to advanced D&D. Now, I know some of them did. I'm going to call him a friend, even though I haven't met him in person, but Mark Clover from Creative Mountain Games, he comments on every one of my videos. He has a great show on YouTube and a podcast called the OK Grognard Show. And he specifically talks about running a first edition advanced D&D game. So I highly recommend it if you're interested in that edition and just hearing like how it's played, because he talks a lot about the campaign that he runs. He told me that they made the switch immediately from original D&D to advanced. Like he didn't ever truck with any of these other basic systems that we have here. Okay, but a lot of old-time players didn't want that. They didn't like the fiddliness of the rules of advanced D&D, and they wanted something more simple that was closer to what they started with original. And so a lot of them were gravitating to this basic set, even though it only covers levels 1 through 3. So it was actually kind of backwards from what the folks at TSR had thought. They had thought that new players would go to the basic set and that established players would immediately grab advanced D&D because it had all the rules. Now, that does happen sometimes, but there was another large contingent where it was completely the opposite. I think the other thing that they didn't address, but I think it's pretty clear, kids always want to be older than they are. And so seeing that you had an option between playing basic Dungeons & Dragons and advanced Dungeons & Dragons, most kids are going to want to have advanced because they're going to feel like basic makes it sound like that they're not smart enough to play the advanced. And so from a bragging rights standpoint, they're going to pick advanced. I know when I started with the Moldvay Basic set with my friends, as soon as we discovered that there were hardback books called Advanced D&D, we stopped playing Moldvay. At least we thought we stopped playing. I've talked about that on the channel before, but we dove whole hog into advanced D&D as far as like the classes and spells and all that kind of stuff. And we did look at basic D&D as being like kiddie D&D. If anybody out there watches Stranger Things, there's a season where Lucas's younger sister, I think is Erica, she comes up to the older kids and says that she wants to play like D&D with them. And they had been playing basic, but by this point it's later in the series and they've moved to advanced D&D. And so she says, can I play Dungeons and Dragons with you? And they're like, well, we don't want to have to teach you how to play. And she goes, I know how to play. I've been playing. And then the dungeon master, he's like, class and level. He's being very smug. Class and level. He says, I bet you're a level 1 dwarf. And all the kids laugh. And the implication of that is that if she's a level 1 dwarf, that means that she's playing Moldvay Basic D&D or maybe BECMI, okay, which has your class is your race and vice versa. So you play a dwarf or an elf or a halfling. And so they're basically teasing her, saying that like she's not smart enough to play advanced. Of course, she comes back with a retort. Turns out she is playing advanced, and that's a whole other thing. But that was part of it. So I think this idea of little kids not wanting to play the basic version of the game. And of course, if you're older and already playing and you have a system that you like, you probably didn't care about that. That wasn't as important to you. So what's going to happen is this basic series of the line, whether it's, Holmes, but also Mentzer or the BECMI version, and then the Moldvay Marsh version, the BX, the BECMI versions, they are going to be a lot closer mechanically to original D&D. They are going to make changes as well, but they're much closer to original D&D than they are to advanced D&D in terms of the game mechanics. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why they created the basic system. Now, also, you have to consider the lawsuits. Okay, so Dave Arneson has left TSR at this point, and it's very well known that he is going to sue the company in order to get royalties that he believes that he's owed. There's a whole thing about this. We're not going to get into it too much, but one of the things that's going to happen is that TSR is going to claim that Dave Arneson should not get any royalties on Advanced Dungeons & Dragons because this is 100% written by Gary Gygax alone, solo. Whereas original D&D, it says right on the box, Gygax and Arneson, and anything that derives from original D&D, then Arneson should get royalties on. But the TSR claim was that Arneson had nothing to do with the creation of Advanced D&D. I'm not saying whether the argument's true or not. It's not going to fly, I'll tell you that. But that was the argument they were making. So it was in TSR's best interest to have a separate edition of Dungeons & Dragons running currently at the same time as Advanced, so that they could say, no, these editions over here, Moldvay, Cook, Marsh, or BECMI, those are the D&D that Arneson should get royalties on. But this advanced D&D, like, this is a whole separate thing. That was the argument they were making. So there was a legal reason why TSR was going to keep these games or wanted to keep these games in print and keep them separate. So that is some of the background leading to why there was a different edition of D&D in like two different editions of D&D, the advanced and the basic line. Now, why are we going to have only a 2-year time span between the Moldvay Cook Marsh edition of Dungeons & Dragons coming out, these 2 box sets here, and the BECMI version of D&D that's going to happen just 2 years later? It's really interesting. So 1981 is when the Moldvay Cook Marsh edition of D&D gets published. Now, I've heard people say it came out in 1980. It didn't. It came out in 1981. It was supposed to be out in October of 1980, I think, for some conventions. What I have read is that they missed that date. When Moldvay Cook Marsh comes out in 1981, Gary Gygax and the team at TSR had hired Tom Moldvay, who's the editor of the basic set, and then Dave Cook and Steve Marsh, who edited the expert set, to kind of, and they go together here, as you can see by the cover art. That's going to be important here in a second. But they were hired to work on this and publish it in 1981 to revise the Holmes system, because, again, it's not really a revision of Holmes, actually, but they were trying to keep it as separate from Advanced D&D as possible. And because Holmes edition makes references to Advanced D&D, they needed a version out there that was completely separate, that they could say, no, this is a different game. So that's one of the reasons they separate. And it's one of the reasons why this edition starts to become its own standalone thing. And like, this is why you have your race is your class in this edition. This is the first edition that does it, the Moldvay Cook Marsh edition. Now, when the Holmes edition first started selling, what I have read, and sometimes it's hard to get these sales numbers because they weren't always accurately reported, but the Holmes edition of Dungeons & Dragons box set, what I've seen is that it was selling between 2,000 and 3,000 copies a month at the start, and that at the end of its product lifestyle, it was selling up to like as high as 50,000 units a month, which is giant, right, for a company like TSR size, okay? So now, by the time you get to the Moldvay Cook Marsh edition, in the first year alone of these sets coming out, the box set for basic Dungeons & Dragons, the Moldvay Cook Marsh edition, is going to sell 750,000 units. Okay? Again, to put that into perspective, the entire product life cycle of the Player's Handbook for Advanced D&D is going to sell 1.5 million units. And Moldvay Cook Marsh, the first year alone, it's going to sell half that, like just in 1 year. Okay. And Moldvay Cook Marsh only runs for 2 years. So that seems like a huge hit, 750,000 units. And that doesn't even include what they were selling on the expert set. Okay. So then what happened? Why did they make this switch so quick? Well, in year 2, 1982, the sales for the Moldvay Cook Marsh edition are going to fall dramatically. Now, John Peterson, in his book, I have over here, The Game Wizards, he says sales fell 16% for this, which is still a lot. That's huge. I've seen other numbers. Ben Riggs talks to Slaying at the Dragon. He gives a different account. And when you look at the total sales for what sold for the Moldvay Basic boxed set, so just the basic set, The entire product life history of this, what I've seen, is 1.26 million units. So if we know that it sold 750,000 units in 1981, that means it's selling somewhere in the neighborhood of 510,000 units in year 2, 1982. So that's a much bigger drop than 16%. That's like a 33% drop, roughly. Okay. And I've also seen as high as it fell by like 40%. So again, these numbers are kind of muddy, but the big thing here is that sales in 1982 for this set dropped dramatically. And it's not the only thing that's going to drop. Sales for TSR as a whole are going to be stagnant in 1982 or drop, okay, versus 1981. So this was a big deal. And so TSR realizes that this set is not selling. The Moldvay Basic set is not selling in year 2 as much as it sold in year 1. And so they're going to create a committee to try to figure out why that is. And they go through all this analysis. And one of the things that comes out of this that they say is that, well, partly it's due to the rise in popularity of video games, which were becoming a big thing at this time. I remember my friends getting, an Atari 2600. I've never been a video game player, so it was not really a thing for me, but it was big in the world and in the United States. Okay. And so they're going to say that's one of the reasons why this doesn't sell as well in 1982. Gary Gygax is going to disagree with that and basically say, no, the video games have nothing to offer a D&D player, and that they're two completely different audiences, and that video games can't give the D&D player what they want, which is the social interaction that you get at the table. This is what Gary's claiming. Okay. And I think that there's something to that. However, I think Gary's being very short-sighted to not consider video games being a competitor, because he's just being too literal about what a competitor is. And I think Gary's thinking like Tunnels and Trolls or RuneQuest or Traveler. Those are competitors to D&D. He's being limited. Now, he didn't say this. This is my words. But given that he didn't think that video games were a problem that would affect sales of Dungeons and Dragons, I think it's not understanding that people have a limited amount of money and they have a limited amount of time. And once you spend your time and your money on either your job or your school, okay, and then your food and your bills and your mortgage and all that kind of stuff, you have a limited amount of time and money left to spend on entertainment in general. And video games are a form of entertainment, as are role-playing games, as are going to the movies and watching television and reading books and all this kind of stuff. All of those are competitors. And so you have a new category entering the realm of taking away people's time and money in video games. So obviously they were competitors. I mean, I'm not telling you guys anything you don't know. I'm just showing how I think it would have helped if Gary had looked at it from that standpoint, but he doesn't. What Gary's going to say is that, no, it's the economy. So the United States was in a recession, and people were watching their money. And I'm sure this is now 2025. I'm making this video, and I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that even now. And so he's saying, like, that's part of the problem is the fact that, it's just we're in a recession, and that's the reason why this Moldvay set doesn't sell as well as 1982. Now, I'm not sure that argument necessarily makes sense with what his solution is going to be. But he's going to say, basically, that he's going to hire Frank Mentzer, or he's taking Frank Mentzer under his wing to come out with a new set. So we'll read here from, again, this is from Game Wizards by John Peterson. And he says, Gygax's solution to the problem was simple. And then in quotes, this is Gary Gygax writing to the executives at TSR. Frank Mentzer will be joining me for training soon. Frank will be in charge of the work necessary in both D&D and AD&D products. Gygax believed that he and Mentzer had a firmer grip. Now, that was the end of the quote. Gygax believed that he and Mentzer had a firmer grasp on the needs of the market than TSR's marketing people. And then the quote resumes. For some time, Gygax related with exasperation, I have stated exactly what these product lines needed, and this has been ignored. I have taken steps to correct it. I will see that it is taken care of. And then it says, in this widely circulated memo, which also went to the Bloom brothers, Duke Seafried, and others, Gygax very conspicuously placed his bet that Mentzer would rescue the basic set. Now, when he says rescue, I guess he just means get it back on track to reach a higher sales number. I'm not clear if Gygax had if Gary had problems with the mechanics or anything with the basic set from the Moldvay version, but he's going to hire Frank Mentzer to put it out. I think just part of the idea is that they're going to just have new a new basic set coming out that, you know, a lot of people might buy again because it looks different, right? So that's part of it, like new trade dress. Same thing like when TSR does the Jeff Easley covers for the advanced D&D line in 1983. I think that's part of it as well. New cover on the same book, a lot of people might buy it again because they're completionists and they want all of it, okay? Now, I think the other thing that they don't really address is the idea that if the Moldvay version of this basic set reaches 750,000 units in sales, how many more people are out there playing that don't already own this box set then at this point? Like at a certain point, you are going to hit market saturation. I know that the thought was we're constantly going to grow our players, and you will. But if you have a product that sells that much, I mean, this is, let's be honest, or at least at this time period, a pretty niche hobby. So if you've got advanced D&D players handbooks circulating, you still have the original box set, the white box, and now in the original collector's edition, that is still being sold. You had Holmes just recently selling 50,000 copies a month. And then you have this selling 750,000 copies in its first year of publication. You're starting to saturate your market as far as like how many people are going to be buying core rules for advanced D&D. And it's partly why Dungeons & Dragons is going to end up shifting, or TSR is going to end up shifting and putting out more like supplemental materials as opposed to new rule books. Okay. But that's a whole other thing. Okay. So that's going on. Now, there's other things going on that are going to lead us to why are we going to come up with a new box set for the BECMI edition after just 2 years of Moldvay? Well, TSR is growing as a company. It's in the news. It's in financial publications. It's being lauded as being like one of the fastest growing privately held companies in the United States, like during this time. And they had goals. The executives had goals to grow the company. And one of those goals is going to be getting bigger mass market distribution for the game out of the traditional hobby shop distribution. Okay. And so that means moving into outlets like Sears and Kmart and Toys R Us, where you have a lot more competition of, again, you've got video games and board games and puzzles and Lego sets and Star Wars figures at the time. You're competing against all of that stuff, and you need to stand out on the shelves. Okay, so while this is just the cover art for the Dungeon Masters rulebook, it's the same cover art on the box set. Okay, so you have this giant logo up here and this sitting on a shelf. I mean, it looks a little more professional. I love the Errol Otis art. So it's not really the art as much. I mean, although this is a very striking picture by Larry Elmore, we're going to talk about that in a second. But just the trade dress of this box set for basic Dungeons and Dragons, it looks a little bit more limited versus this one starts to look like, and when I say this one, I'm talking about the BECMI version. It starts to look a little bit more, I hate to say professional because, again, I'm not trying to denigrate the Errol Otis art because this is what I grew up with and what I loved. But standing on a shelf, if you're looking at a shelf of things and you're going to pick something to play, this BECMI one probably is going to stick out a little bit more. But let's dive into that a little bit deeper. So if you look at the box sets for the basic and expert sets from the Moldvay version of the game, you can see there is a pretty consistent look. You've got this yellow band in the upper corner here. You've got the 1 and the 2 for the, basic and expert. You have the same font being used for Dungeons and Dragons. You have the green TSR and the green fantasy adventure game. And then, of course, the expert set very cleverly calls back to the basic set by having the wizard, using a spell to kind of scry on what's happening on the cover of the basic set. So those two tie together. However, let's look at the adventures that were designed to go with this basic set. Okay, so I'm going to pull them out. I'm not going to include B1 because this monochrome version was originally created to go with the Holmes edition of D&D, so we'll discount that one, although this is the one that would have been on the shelves around the time that this came out. They are going to redo this B1 with a new cover that's full color. It's like brown full color, but we're not going to talk about that. But let's just look at, let's look at module B2. This was the module that was shipped in this box in the Moldvay Basic set. It was also shipped at the end of the life of the Holmes Basic. We just talked about that. I did a whole video covering the basic modules. But look at the trade dress for this module here. The font Dungeon Module B2, keep on the borderline. It's completely different. It has nothing to do with this kind of font that we use with the Dungeons and Dragons on the basic set. So if you're right now, if you're watching, or I'm sorry, if you're listening to the video and not watching, you're definitely going to want to bookmark this part because it's important to look at the art to kind of understand what I'm talking about. Okay. You have B2 up in the corner here, completely different once again from the font. Like this is a black 1 and a white circle. This is B2 in yellow with no circle. You have an orange band here, dark orange, that says for Dungeons and Dragons basic set. Okay, but then let's look at the next module in the series. This is B3, Palace of the Silver Princess. This is the B3 that gets out to mass distribution. Again, we just talked about that. But now we have the yellow band, but it has black type for Dungeons and Dragons basic set, whereas the band on the box is red type, and it's a completely different font. Okay, and then it says B3, and then it says Dungeon Module. Once again, look at this. This font over here on B3 doesn't look it's a completely different font than what's on B2. So yeah, like superficially, these look like they probably go together. The numbers help B2 and B3. Okay, but there's no consistency in the trade dress. And then B4, same thing. B4, the Lost City, closer to B3. Okay, but again, nothing in common with the covers of these box sets that came out. Okay, now let's look at the box set for the BECMI edition. We have this new Dungeons & Dragons font, this very highly stylized ampersand sign with a dragon breathing fire. Okay, now let's look at the modules. I don't have B5, but I will show B6. They first do this with B5 Whore on the Hill. I just don't have that one. So B6, look, it's the same font, Dungeons and Dragons. And then it uses the same, like, see, Dungeon Master's Rulebook. It's using a similar font here, Basic Game Adventure, Veiled Society. Okay, we've moved the bar. There's no more yellow tag here because the BECMI version gets rid of that yellow diagonal stripe here. Okay, so they just put at the top this colored band. Okay, and then here is B7, Rahasia. And if you look at B6 and B7 together, these clearly aren't for the same game. You can see they've got this colored band at the top. They have the same font for the Dungeons and Dragons with the stylized ampersand with the dragon breathing fire. They have the same fonts consistently, okay, all the way through. So this is something that TSR is learning in just a couple of years, to have this consistent trade dress, because it makes them look more professional when they're moving into these more mass market stores, distribution outlets. So that is a big part of it. Okay, so that's going to get us up to the reasons that this BECMI edition was made just 2 years after. Hopefully, that adds a little bit of background and color to the decision. Again, I know we're really far into this, and I haven't really gotten into the meats and bolts of BECMI, but it's important to understand why this was created in the first place, which is a huge part of what this channel is. It's about the history, not necessarily about the mechanics. Now, I do want to tell you, one of the things that's interesting, since we're just talking about the cover art for the BECMI edition, is that this was not the original cover art, what we see here. So this is the book Art and Arcana, published by Wizards of the Coast. And, very cleverly, they use the Elmore painting from the BECMI set as the cover. But if we come in here and look at what we have here, well, one really fun, I think, is to see these foreign editions of Dungeons and Dragons. So you see this is a French edition of the basic set that uses the trade dress from the BECMI edition, but it uses the cover painting from Errol Otis from the Moldvay edition. So I think that's fascinating to see, like, both of them kind of juxtaposed here together. And then you can see here just some other ones. But this is what I wanted to show you. So this sketch drawing here, this was the original version of the painting. And again, it's going to be hard to explain if you're just listening, but you still have the same fighter with the shield and the sword in almost the exact same pose. It's very, very close. Okay, you have the dragon, the red dragon in the back. However, he's facing a different direction. So he's coming from the right and he's facing left. It's going to get reversed, even though the fighter is going to stay in the same position. But it expands beyond that to see all the dragon's gold. And then you have this halfling who is rifling through this treasure chest down here with all these golds and gems. He's just looking over his shoulder as the fighter's taking on the dragon by himself. And then you have this woman over here who I think that she's supposed to be kind of reminiscent of this woman here, the red dress, okay, that's casting a spell on the Moldvay version. She's blonde, and here you have another blonde woman in a red dress who's clearly a magic user, right? Might be a cleric, but I don't think so because she's not wearing armor. And so you had a party of adventurers who were fighting this dragon. And again, that is part of what D&D is all about. It's having a party of adventurers. But Gary Gygax is going to say no. So this is Frank Mentzer himself holding this original painting. They have a little inset here. But Gary's going to say after. So what happened was Errol Otis kept getting direction after direction from different executives at TSR telling him, no, change this, change that, change this. And he got tired of it. And so he just went directly to Gary, knocked on the door and went in and said, what should I do? And Gary said, crop it just on the dragon and the fighter fighting, and make the dragon look like it's, its claws are like reaching out to grab you, like going beyond the box, like the outline, or whatever you want to call it, the frame, I guess I should say. And so Elmore does this, and this becomes the classic cover art. It's an iconic painting, and I like it a lot. I always kind of lament that this is kind of the start of D&D art that's going to get us away from this idea of a party of adventurers who are adventuring like we see on the Trampier cover of the Player's Handbook. Okay. And instead it goes to this idea of like the hero, the heroic, gallant fighter taking on this dragon. And he's doing it by himself, which is not what D&D is about. It's a group effort. But anyway, I thought it would be fun to look at that original art. And now we are going to start looking at the differences between the BECMI version of D&D and the Moldvay Basic version. Okay, and we're going to try something new this time as we dive into BECMI. Since I'm looking at these on my laptop as PDFs, I am plugging my microphone directly into my laptop because I got a new laptop right at the end of last year, 2024. So I'm doing this to avoid having to record the audio through my phone separately from recording my screen and then trying to sync the two videos, which takes forever, or the two files. So hopefully this is going to work, but you guys let me know if you need me to go back to doing the separate voice recording on my phone. But I was hoping this was going to work. Okay, so this is the commonly called the red box. This is the basic Dungeons and Dragons game for BECMI, the version. And again, we have this artwork here for the Larry Elmore artwork on the front cover here. Okay, so it says read this book first. So this is the big difference that's going to come in the BECMI edition, is that each of the box sets are going to have a player's manual and like a game master's manual, a dungeon master's manual. And that's different from what we saw in the Moldvay Marsh version, where all the rules were put into one book. And then the second book in those two box sets was an adventure. So it was B2, Keep on the Borderlands, for the basic set, and it was X1, Isle of Dread, for the expert set. Instead here, again, you're going to have a player's manual and a dungeon master's manual, and there's no module packaged in the box set. Okay, so we'll go ahead and dive in here. And, you just see over here on the left-hand page is the preface by Frank Mentzer. I'm not going to get too far into that. How to use this book is pretty, standard kind of stuff. So you see that it's revised by Frank Mentzer. And so Frank was hired into TSR pretty early on. We will see again that he is listed in the credits as working on the Moldvay Marsh edition. So Frank does list them over here under acknowledgements. Dave Arneson, he's got Brian Bloom, Dave Cook, Ann C. Gray. Now Ann was going to be one of the people that kind of like helped on the editing for this. Has kind of an interesting story. She's actually pretty involved in these, but she came to TSR, I don't want to say late, but she was hired, I believe, in 1982. Originally, she had applied for a job as like an assistant in one of the divisions, and she didn't get that job, but she got later hired on as a copy editor. And this product here, this basic set, is one of the first things that she's going to edit. And she says that she didn't know anything about Dungeons and Dragons before she started working on this. So it was kind of like she got thrown into the fire right away. But it's kind of cool. She ends up working on this whole line of BECMI. You see Ernie, Gary, Alan Hammock, Kevin Hendricks, John Eric Holmes, Harold Johnson, Tim Kask, Jeff Key, Rob Kuntz, Alan Lucian, Steve Marsh, Tom Moldvay, Mike Mornard, John Pickens, Brian Pitzer, Michael Price, Patrick L. Price, Paul Reich, Evan Robinson, Gordon Schick, Lawrence Schick, Don Snow, Edward G. Solers, Gary Spiegel, maybe, Stephen D. Sullivan, Ralph Wagner, Jim Ward, Gene Wells, and Bill Wilkerson. We've pretty much talked about all those people before. Also, thanks also to Donald Patterson for opening my own door to the D&D world, and special thanks to Harold Johnson, who escorted me in. So a lot of the people who worked on previous editions as well are being thanked here, I think, kind of as like a legacy. Okay, but as far as like getting into like some of the nitty gritty, a lot of the differences in BECMI are not going to be, especially in the basic and the expert sets, are not going to be mechanically different. It's really just differences in terms of the presentation. So this is really written to be instructional to new players. So learning how to play, start here. A dungeon is a group of rooms and quarters in which monsters and treasures can be found, and you will find them as you play the role of characters in a fantasy world. There are many kinds of monsters, but dragons are the biggest and most dangerous and have the most treasure. So it goes through that, and then it says what is, in quotes, role playing. Then you have what role will I play? And then that says, imagine it is another place, another time. The world's much like ours was long ago, with knights and castles and no science or technology, no electricity, no modern comforts of any kind. Imagine dragons are real, werewolves are real, monsters of all kinds live in caves and ancient ruins, and magic really works. Imagine you are a strong hero, a famous but poor fighter. Day by day, you explore the unknown, looking for monsters and treasure. The more you find, the more powerful and famous you become. And then it describes your character's basic abilities, your first adventure. So this is still part of the learning how to play the Dungeons and Dragons games. Now, it's interesting over here on the left, it says learning how to play the Dungeons and Dragons games. On the right, it says learning how to play the Dungeons and Dragons games with an exclamation point. But this is going to start you off with sort of almost like a little kind of story. It says your hometown is just a small place with dirt roads. You set off one morning and hike to the nearby hills. There are several caves in the hills, caves where treasures can be found, guarded by monsters. And it kind of like goes on. And so it's written very much like a choose your own adventure. It says, as you approach the entrance, you look around. It's a nice day and everything seems peaceful. And then so suddenly you see a goblin. He is smaller than you are and looks like an ugly little man with gray skin. He sees you, gives a scream, waves his sword, and attacks. You dodge his blow and raise your sword to swing. If the goblin hadn't attacked right away, you might have tried talking to him. But now you have no choice. You must fight for your life. And then it goes right into how to hit. This is on page 3. So it's basically giving you a snapshot of what this game's going to be. How to hit, telling you about rolling your hit roll, rolling dice, comparing it to an armor class, damage and hit points. Constitution is your health. So it goes all through that. Okay, and then it says poisoned. That you come across a snake on the previous page. It says this is a poisonous snake, and so it goes through saving throws, and then you go on, and it's this long kind of introductory story, and then it's telling you it has like some highlighted areas. So you get hurt, and so it says like on your sheet, cross out your hit points and write down 8. The full amount you started with, because you've been healed now. And so it says, since you don't know about clerics, let me explain. This is the cleric that you come across. Very famous. This is Alina, this picture down here by Larry Elmore, Alina the cleric. And she's going to share your adventure with you. And so you come to like Lena as a traveling companion. And then you have your starting adventure. And it keeps going on and on. And then now we see here, Alina's fighting. She has her mace raised. Looks like we're fighting some goblins here. And then, so we're still in the learning to play Dungeons and Dragons games. But now it says ending 1. You missed a saving throw. So again, like I said, very, very much like a choose your own adventure. So it says you run at him hoping for a chance to swing before he can complete the spell. So you're fighting a magic user. Okay, it says, watching you carefully, he starts saying magic words and waving his hands. He's casting a spell. So you run at him, hoping for a chance to swing. It says, roll the die once again. You must make a saving throw against the spell. If you roll a 16 or less, the magic takes effect. Read the next section, ending number 1 for this adventure. If you roll a 17 or higher, your fighter avoids the spell. Skip to ending number 2. So again, I'm not going to get too far into this, but they have these 2 different endings. Well, ending 2 is pretty sad because I guess spoiler alert if you plan to read this, but Alina is going to be killed. And it was like this affected a lot of people who this was their first exposure to D&D. Like, you think it's the main character and the main character is going to die. It's just a story, but that's kind of like what happened. Okay, so then it has alignment, how characters and monsters behave. This is going to use the 3-point alignment system, law, chaos, and neutrality. And then it talks about your character sheet, your ability scores, your sketch, if you want to have that, your adjustments, saving throws. None of this is different at this point from what's in the Moldvay Basic version. It's just presented differently, as I said. It goes through the combat chart, magic items, normal items, equipment list, money and treasure. So all of this up front is just telling you like kind of how to play. Okay, it talks about experience, it talks about dice, and then it gets into town business. So now there's a solo adventure. In the following one-player adventure, you explore a dungeon looking for monsters and treasure. Part 1 is a shopping trip in town. In Part 2, you will learn more about battles. And in Part 3, you will visit the dungeon. And so most of this art in here is by Larry Elmore, even these black and white pieces. Although I believe as we see up in the introduction, there's also going to be art, yes, by Jeff Easley. So again, this was intended to more be a talk about, was there anything different in here versus what is in the BECMI edition? So we get through the solo edition, and then you have your Dungeons & Dragons characters. And now we're finally going to get into here on page 23, how to create a character classes, your prime requisite, your saving throws. Again, these are all very, very similar to what we saw in the Moldvay Basic book. And here we have clerics and the description. So one of the small changes here in terms of the presentation is that in the Moldvay Basic rulebook, the undead turning table goes up through wraiths, whereas here in Mentzer Basic, it goes up through wights. So this is what I'm talking about. These changes are very, very minimal, and they're very, very superficial. They don't really change the way that you play the game. We still have our level titles, acolytes, adepts, and priests or priestesses. We have our cleric saving throw table, like all of that kind of stuff is all pretty consistent, okay? So again, clerics in this version of the game do not get a spell at first level, none. And then they get their first spell at second level, they get one first level spell, and then at third level, they have 2 first level spells. So there's your clerics. Okay, and then it goes through and then it's going to present the cleric spell. So again, difference in presentation, the spells are going to get presented here instead of in a different book. Spells pretty much work the same. Some of the differences are going to be in like the detect evil spell. It's just explained a little bit more. It says, remember that chaotic does not automatically mean evil, although many chaotic monsters have evil intentions. Traps and poison are neither good nor evil, merely dangerous. So again, this is because, and we just did a whole video on alignment, but there is no evil or good in this version of the game. There's lawful, chaotic, and there's neutral. And so detect evil got confusing because there's no evil alignment in basic. So what are you detecting? And so that tries to explain that to you. So again, a little bit of a difference. Now we have our fighters. This is pretty much going to be exactly the same as what we saw before. And then we're going to get to, here's a little character record sheet that shows us how to fill it out. Okay, and then we have our sample characters. And then we're going to get, so all that is kind of like coming in the middle of the book. And then we're going to get to our magic users. Okay, so magic users, slightly different. In Moldvay, magic users start with 1 spell in their spell books, and scrolls can't be used to add new spells to the spell book. Effectively, your magic user in Moldvay is essentially going to have a number of spells known equal to the spells per day. Okay, now in Mentzer, that is going to change. Magic users are going to start out with 2 spells in their spell book, and then they can use scrolls to add new spells to the spell book. So that has been a hampering, like in the game I run for my daughter and her friends. I gave my daughter's elf, we rolled on a table for spells. I didn't pick the spells, but they also didn't get to pick their spells. And my daughter rolled Read Magic as her first level spell as an elf, which means that she can read scrolls, but she's the only one that can read scrolls. The other elf in the group can't read scrolls that they come across. But also when my daughter reads a scroll, it doesn't automatically go into her spell book. Okay, so that's like a little bit of a difference with magic items or magic users, I should say. Okay, so we keep going through the magic users, then we get to, eventually we're going to get to thieves. Okay, but we have our magic user spells here. The spells are pretty standard. They don't really change all that much other than what we've already talked about. Moldvay Basic does not have this spell down here on the right-hand page, page 41 of Detect Invisible. Moldvay Basic does not have that spell, but this one does. Okay, Charm Person is going to be explained a lot more here in the Moldvay version of the game, where it's going to explain, because there was a lot left out in Moldvay, and so I'm sorry, in the BECMI version, it's going to be explained a lot more detailed to kind of help fend off all these questions that had continued to come up. People would argue about it a lot. Okay, so again, those are some of the minor changes that are made, but mostly just expanding. Okay, then you have your thieves. Okay, now thieves are going to be different in this version of the game, specifically the their abilities to, their skills. Essentially, people call them thief skills, and the progression of the thief skills in Mentzer is different. However, these changes aren't going to take effect until the companion set comes out. So for the basic and expert versions of the BECMI sets, the thief skills are the same as what's in Moldvay. But what's going to happen is once the companion set comes out and Frank Mentzer realizes that he has to scale the thief skills differently to account for many more levels, then he's going to go back and kind of change them. A lot of people say that he nerfed them. Okay, I don't really think nerf is the right word, but thieves were never great, but they do get even a downgrade in later versions, box sets from the BECMI edition. Okay, but you have dwarves here, pretty much the same. Elves, halflings, all of that is going to be pretty much, again, what we saw in the Moldvay edition. So not a lot of changes here. So now we have this section here on players are not characters, and then playing in a group, how to prepare, setting up the mapper and the caller. I just did a whole video on that video on the forgotten D&D rules that actually make the game better. A big part of that was talking about mappers and callers. It was so fun to read the comments of people that either do or don't like those, or did or didn't play with them back in the day. And then you have your marching order and your treasure and your tactics and all this kind of stuff. And then it gives you some adventuring rules. So this is kind of new, and it is helpful, I think. It talks about using your equipment: iron spikes and hammers, mirrors, rations and wineskins, rope, wolfsbane, wooden poles, like all these classic pieces of equipment that people use, and then talking about, like, what do you actually use them for? Section on time and movement, listening, light, doors, traps, wandering monsters. All this is really helpful. Encounter rules, missile weapons. Okay, and then there's a section here on combat maneuvers and fighting withdrawals, retreats. Again, nothing that's not in Moldvay. It's just explained maybe a little bit more clearly in here. The world of D&D gaming, finding other players, higher level characters, and then it has other player aids, a glossary. It talks about advanced Dungeons and Dragons a little bit here at the end. It talks about using retainers. You have some ads here. And then we're going to get into our Dungeon Master's rulebook. Okay, so I'm going to just breeze through this very, very quickly, but this is essentially explaining the rules. And again, it says illustrations by Larry Elmore and Jeff Easley, but we're also going to add Jim Holloway to doing art on this one as well in the Dungeon Master's book. And gives you terms and abbreviations, definitions, etc. Group adventure, and it says start, read font to the players. So this is the era of the box text, and there's a ton of it in here to give you an example of how to run a game. The monsters are going to be in here a little bit, so it talks about that. And this is the your first game section. Now, what's interesting in here is that they changed the name of some of the monsters in here, which is really interesting versus what was in the Moldvay edition. So in Moldvay, you have cave locusts, and in here in BECMI, you have giant locusts. And then in Moldvay, you have driver ants, and in BECMI, you have giant ants. And then in Moldvay, you have killer bees, and in BECMI, you have giant bees. So those are some of the changes that are made. Again, like I'm saying, it's very, very minimal. It's very superficial, I would even say. Whole section on dragons in here, and you can see some of those monsters that we were just talking about. Okay, and then you have your treasure type here at the end. So this is kind of presented very similarly to what we would have seen in the original 3 books. All right, and then you have your index for the player's manual. So briefly, in the expert set, very similar in idea here. So we have the cover painting by Larry Elmore, and that is going to be something that's consistent throughout this edition, different from the Moldvay Cook Marsh edition, where you had Tom Moldvay editing the basic set, and you had Dave Cook and Steve Marsh working on the expert set. In this version, BECMI version, Frank Mentzer is going to work on all 5 of these box sets. He's the lead on all of them, which means they have a consistent voice in the way that they're written. But also consistent is that Larry Elmore is going to do all of the covers for this line. At the same time that Larry Elmore is doing all the covers for this, Jeff Easley is doing all of the covers. Well, he's redoing all of the covers for the original Advanced D&D books, except for the Fiend Folio. It's the only one that doesn't get a revised cover. But the Player's Handbook, Monster Manual, and Dungeon Master's Guide are going to get revised covers. And then Deities and Demigods is going to be renamed Legends and Lore, and is going to get a revised cover. So very quickly, as someone that's new to the game, Larry Elmore's art style is very different and distinct from Jeff Easley. So in addition to one being called advanced and one not being called advanced, you can also look at the art and kind of get a sense of which things are supposed to go together. Okay, so here's our expert set. And here you see it says revised by Frank Mentzer, editing by Ann C. Gray. So that's what I was talking about when Ann kind of comes in to start working on these. So over here in the tables of contents, you just see it's sort of like the introduction, the player information, all that kind of stuff that we saw before, just laid out differently. So it's talking about the expert game, and then it jumps into things like horses. And because remember, the expert set is for adventuring in the wilderness. It's going to cover character levels 4 through 14, which is what the Moldvay Cook Marsh version of the expert set did. And so that's just what this is. It's just bringing your characters up to a higher level. Okay, but then they repeat all of the levels. So you see over here, the cleric experience table still starts at level 1, so that you can see everything all at once. That's smart that they do that, but it does mean as you go on through these sets, they're going to repeat more and more often. Okay, so again, not going to go through too much detail on this. Now, what's going to happen with if you're not familiar with this version of the game, non-human characters, they call them demi-humans. I think now they're called humanoids or something, but back in the day, they called them demi-humans. And it was that was dwarfs, elves, and halflings. They do not get to advance up to level 14. So dwarves have a level cap of 12. Elves have a level cap of 10, and halflings have a level cap of 8. Now, we're going to see that change a little bit as we get into the companion and masters sets, but originally, this is matching what we saw in the Moldvay Cook Marsh edition of the level caps for those characters. And that goes all the way back to original D&D had those level caps, okay, for non-human characters. So that was the whole section on adventuring. And then you get to the Dungeon Masters section here. And this is going to talk a little bit about combat and clans and climbing and construction details for building some castles, how to war experience points, mixing levels of characters, NPC parties. That is going to be a little bit different in how you put an NPC party together if you're going to roll randomly between that versus Moldvay, but it's not that big of a deal. It talks about things like taxes and wishes and strongholds and swimming, all that kind of stuff. You've got your increased monsters stuff. You have a little map here for kind of like a sample adventure. And then you have the lands and environs of the D&D wilderness. Now, this is based on the known world that was presented in the expert set and also in module X1 Isle of Dread. So this is later going to be known as, I used to say Mystara or Mystara, but I've been told by William W. Connors, who was an employee at TSR at the time, that internally they said it. What he wrote is, I haven't heard him say it. He wrote to me in a note. He said, we pronounced it like the word mystery. So I'm taking that to mean that they called it Mystara. I've just never called it that, so I have trouble remembering that. But that's what you have over here on the right-hand side. And then on the left, you have the Grand Duchy of Keramikos maps. So these are like your wilderness maps. You have your encounter tables, your magical treasures, your D&D campaign, sample wilderness. We talked about that. Adventures in the wilderness and things like weather. All this stuff that we've seen before in the Moldvay Basic set is going to be in here. So again, I know I'm going through that pretty quickly, but that's what's in here. Now, you have X1 Isle of Dread, and this is the revised cover of the module. And so the trade dress for the original Isle of Dread, which came out in the Moldvay Cook Marsh version of the expert set, is going to be here in X1. So this is the one exception that I mentioned at the beginning, how these box sets are going to be divided between a player's book and a dungeon master's book. In the expert box set, all of the things that you need are right here in the box in the first rule book, and then it did include the Isle of Dread, which is why they've revised the trade dress here to look more consistent with the BECMI line. So that's going to be our look at the basic and expert sets, and we're going to spend some more time with companion, masters, and immortals. Now, one of the things that is interesting about the basic set, another thing that did change, is that it specifically says on the cover that it is for beginning and intermediate characters or intermediate players ages 10 and up. Whereas on the Moldvay version of the basic set, it says the original fantasy role-playing game for 3 or more adults ages 10 up. So it's a little bit of a difference in the presentation there. But that is, again, that's our look at the basic and expert sets. Just a quick note to say, if you're looking for ways to support me and my channel, Daddy Rolled a One, there are 3 ways you can do that right now. The first is by visiting my shop, and I actually have 2 shops now, but I have a spread shop where you can buy a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, or tote bag. You can call it a bag of holding if you want. Those have exclusive designs that, again, are only available from Daddy Rolled a One, and they're specifically designed for fans of tabletop role-playing games, although I have some kind of like general genre type shirts, one that's kind of Star Wars themed on there as well. And you can also visit my Redbubble shop, and that's where you can pick up stickers, notebooks, or posters. And with the notebook, it's really fun. It's available as either a spiral bound notebook or a hardcover journal. And you can get a choice of blank paper, lined paper, or graph paper. So you could use the graph paper to draw dungeons and stuff like that. Somebody did ask me if the lined paper was standard rule or college rule, and I don't know yet. So I have sent a note in to the folks at Redbubble, and I'm just waiting to hear back. Thanks for your interest on those. And then the other ways that you can support the channel are by buying my supplement, Alchemy, Explosives, and Inventions. And this is written for old school D&D, specifically old school essentials, which means it works with either BX or the Moldvay Basic. But it is 3 new classes: Alchemists, Demolitionists, and Inventors. It has 15 character concepts, which are like backgrounds. It's got dozens and dozens of random tables. It has new equipment. It has a guild hall, 3-story guild hall with NPCs, secrets, intrigue, rumors. And it is available with both a plain white or parchment background and either a POD, a soft cover, or a PDF. And those links are in the show notes down below. And then the last thing you could do is become a super fan of the channel and join this other list of really nice folks who have hit the little heart icon with the $ and contributed to the channel to let me know that they appreciate all the time and effort I put into making the videos. And I really appreciate the folks who are able to do that. So thank you so very much. And if you do become a super fan, you'll get your name listed up here with all these other nice folks. Thanks so much. Okay, now we are going to look at the companion set. This comes out in 1984, featuring this very striking cover, I think, of a fully armored knight with this glowing magic sword. So we can tell that these characters are increasing in power. If you look at the, painting from the red box from that fighter to the one on the horseback on the expert set, and then this one, there's a castle in the background, and there's this giant green dragon that the character's fighting. And so again, this is 1984, and this is going to be an interesting one. It's going to cover levels 15 through 25, but what's going to happen here is that now from this point forward, Frank Mentzer's on his own as far as how he wants to develop these rules, because he's not looking back at anything that's been developed for the system before, because before the Moldvay Cook Marsh edition only went up to level 14. So he's already covered that. So this is going to be brand new ground that he's covering, and he's having to kind of base it on like his own ideas. Of course, he's got advanced D&D to look at, which doesn't really have level limits, but it doesn't even really get covering as high as this, even in the player's handbook, up to level 25. So this is a little bit of uncharted territory, and but clearly Gary Gygax trusted Frank Mentzer to do this. Okay, now one of the things I mentioned is going to happen, we'll see it in a second, is that a big change is going to happen with the thief class. Once this set comes out, the companion set, we're going to see a change in the thief skills, and I'm going to show that. But for the most part, this is all going to be new. And the companion set really does something that I think is really fun. It leans into the idea that it tells you in the expert set that when you become ninth level as a human, at least, um, if you're a cleric, fighter, magic user, or thief, once you hit that ninth level, that was your name level, and that was when you could start. You could build a stronghold, a temple. Like a magic user, I think builds a tower, and then a thief like starts a guild, right, and attracts followers. And that was sort of like looked at as almost being like an end game kind of thing. Like when you hit that point, you're no longer really adventuring; you're settling down and managing your affairs. And a lot of people would retire their characters at that point and start over. So this companion set is going to give us the details that we need to understand what does it mean to rule over some kind of domain. So this is your domain level rules, and this is something that at this up until this point hadn't really been discussed in any version of Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so it talks a little bit about the changing game at higher levels, upper level games, the path to immortality, which is we're going to end with that in this edition of the game with the Immortals set of rules. And then it says travel or settle. So at this point in your character's career, the path to immortality lie far ahead. No decisions need to be made at this time for this greatness. For this greatness of all goals, immortality, a traveler has as much chance as a settled ruler. Rulership does not mean that the character never travels. It does, however, carry many obligations. Traveling gives the advantages of more and wider experiences, but the disadvantage of less power. A country is usually controlled by its rulers, not those who wander within its boundaries. So that's one of the things that's going to happen in this edition. It's going to give you a choice. Do you want to settle down and manage a domain, or do you want to wander, become a traveler? And they're going to give us some different character options in that are really kind of fun. Okay, but before we get there, we're going to have new armor and weapons and equipment. So it introduces a lot of new weapons, as you see here on these pages. And then it's going to have this whole section on unarmed combat and wrestling procedures and striking procedures. So that's going to come first. And then we get into our strongholds and human strongholds, demi-human strongholds, wilderness, civilization, who is your staff that works at your stronghold, and then like the kinds of people that would work there. You've got peasant workers, of course, but you also have advisors and officials, and it gives you a list here of specialists, artillerists, bailiffs, castellans, chamberlains, etc. Okay. And then it has like other character activity. And here it's talking a little bit about making ability checks, which is a D20 roll under on an ability score, and how to apply that rule during the game and how to use it. Okay. And then we're going to get into our character descriptions. So you start out with our clerics, and we have our turn undead table, which is covering a lot higher level of undead. And our saving throws and experience points tables. And then it talks about becoming a landowner and building a stronghold. And but maybe you choose to travel. And then it talks about like what happens there. Okay. And then it's going to give us our spells. And so now we're covering higher level spells that we've not seen before in this version of the game. And then it gets to this is sort of well, it's one of the first things that we're going to see where it's expanding the rules beyond what we saw in Moldvay Marsh. So that is druids. A neutral cleric of ninth level or greater may choose to study nature instead of remaining among the civilized areas. So this is a really unique way of looking at druids. So druids, you don't start out at first level. You have to be a ninth level cleric and then decide that you want to become a druid if you are neutral. And so that's how the druids are going to get introduced here. And basically, they're just going to get their own set of spells. They have a different philosophy and stuff like that. But mechanically, it says a druid cannot cast any spell that affects good or evil, personal or range, protection from evil, or dispel evil, as an example. New spells only for druids may be cast. A druid must live in a woodland home rather than a town or city. They can't wear metal armor of any type or use metal items. Leather is the only possible armor for druids, and while shield may be used, it must be made entirely of wood. The standard weapon restrictions for clerics apply to druids, and they may only use wooden weapons, a specially made wooden hammer, wooden staff, etc. There are only 9 druids of 30th level, so a lot of this is kind of, copying what we see in advanced D&D as far as like higher level characters. You've got your philosophy here, and then you have your spells, your druid spells. Okay, now fighters, again, kind of interesting, talks about becoming a landowner, and most Dominion-owned territory rulers are fighters and how that works. But it says, okay, what if you want to become a traveler? Well, here you have 3 different choices if you want to become a traveler. If you are a lawful fighter, and or a lawful traveling fighter, you can choose to become a paladin. Or if you don't meet the requirements for becoming a paladin, you can become a knight. And if you want to become a paladin, you have to swear fealty and oath of service to a lawful church to gain paladin status. You must be name level or greater. That's that 9th level. You can, and then it gives you all these powers: detect evil. If your wisdom score is 13 or greater, you can cast cleric spells, and you can turn undead as a cleric if you are a paladin, but at 1/3 the level of the fighter rounded down. And you may only travel with a number of hirelings equal to no more than your clerical level. And you must assist anyone who asks for help, like the kind of stuff that you would expect. It's less fiddly than an advanced D&D paladin, but it's adding paladins to the game. And remember, paladins were part of original D&D once the Greyhawk supplement comes out. Okay, now if you're a neutral wandering fighter, you can become a knight, and they have their own set of rules. If summoned by your liege, you have to report as quickly as possible. If the knight ever refuses to obey the liege or ever swears fealty to any other liege, you lose 3 levels of experience points. And then if you visit any castle, a knight may visit any castle or any territory and request sanctuary. If a call to arms sounds, a call for knights to battle for justice, the knight must respond. These are all your obligations that you're taking on. Now, if you're a chaotic fighter, you can choose, if you meet the requirements, to become an avenger, or if you don't meet the requirements, you can become a knight. So lawful, neutral, and chaotic traveling fighters of name level or higher can become knights. Lawful traveling fighters may choose to become paladins if they meet the requirements, and chaotic fighters may choose to become avengers if they meet the requirements. So this is something I really like. I think it's a cool idea. I like having these different types of characters that are based on alignment. And I think it's something that would be fun to explore with all of the character classes. How would you interpret a magic user that follows law, and how would that be different from a magic user that follows chaos? And I think it could add a lot of fun, like different spell lists and different abilities and things like that. So, but anyway, they're not going to do that with this. So you have your magic users. A traveling magic user is known as a magus or a magus. You may visit any land owning magic user and offer help with magical research. A magus has a chance, checked by the DM, to find treasure maps and to hear rare rumors of powerful magical items. And the magus will attract powerful wandering fighters and clerics who offer to travel and help the magus in return for pay. These followers are of levels much higher than normal, 5th at minimum, no maximum. So that's the benefits of being a traveling magic user. And then, of course, we have our magic user spells, our new spells that are going to be debuting in here for the first time in this edition. And then we have our thieves. So a thief of 15 to 25th level is called a master thief, whether male or female. And you have your experience points table. Now, let's look at these thief ability tables. This is where it's going to get different. So just look at open locks for one. The table tells us that open locks starts at a 75% chance at level 15 and goes up to a 98% chance at level 5. Let's look back really quickly at the expert set, though. So look here. Open locks tops out at 99% at 14th level. And so the companion set has backed that off and said, no, it's 75% at 15th level. So what's happening here is that once this comes out, the expert set is going to get reprinted, and it's going to change the progression of the thief skills in the expert set across the board to lower them at the lower levels so that you can get to higher levels here in the companion set. This is something that a lot of people complained about because it makes low-level thieves even worse than they already are. And it's something that Frank Mentzer's even said, kind of like with hindsight, he's like, yeah, I kind of dropped the ball on that one. Like, he was trying to make it fit in, but it really doesn't work, as we talked about. Now, a wandering thief is known as a rogue, it says. A rogue must remain a member of the Thieves Guild, although the guild need only be visited once a year. Once a character becomes a rogue, the character can never become a guild master in an established branch of the guild. However, a new branch may be started if permitted by the guild master general. The rogue has a chance, checked by the DM once per game week, of discovering treasure maps or rumors about the location of great treasures. A rogue may visit any branch of the Thieves Guild to see the guild master. Local information, tips, and rumors may thus be gained. If assistance is required, the guild will allow. Rumor about the rogue and the character's activities will arise for better or worse. So that's your wandering rogue or wandering thief. Now, character classes, demi-humans, experience points. Remember, this campaign set theoretically doesn't apply to any of these characters because they have already capped out at their top levels 12 for dwarves, 10 for elves, and 8 for halflings. But this is going to tell you that, well, there's things that you can do essentially. And it talks about this idea of like clan relics that you can have. And there's elf clans, there's halfling clans, there's dwarf clans. And it talks all about these different clan relics that you can carry that have different abilities, different powers. The other thing it's going to do is telling you that as you continue gaining experience points, so it's going to let you continue gaining experience points even though you're not gaining levels anymore, but you can gain attack ranks by letter type. And those attack ranks are going to come up later. We're going to see them especially in the Master set, but it's basically making sure that your demi-human characters can still function at higher levels, even though they're not gaining levels anymore. It's what would have been better, I think, would have been to just lift the level limits and let them expand, and they could have made that change, but they didn't. They kept the level limits from the Moldvay Cook Marsh edition and then added on all these extra goodies to make it seem like, oh, well, they're still improving. They're just not gaining levels. It's a little convoluted, and we'll leave it at that. All right, now we have another map here and some new map symbols, and that is the player's part of the guide. And then you have the DM guide in book 2. And this is going to get really into the idea of building that domain and what that means. So obtaining a dominion, finding the area to build, colonization and enfeoffment, conquest, founding it, land grants, and the population, and then the title of people who run these different dominions, and how the income, the record keeping, the expenses, holidays, troops, general notes. It gets pretty detailed, but I think this is really cool because, again, this is stuff that we've never seen before in a D&D product. And it's pretty good, I think. It's pretty detailed, but it's pretty good. So it talks about different titles, royalty and nobility titles, and other titles, depending on what kind of government exists in the domain. And then it is going to present a system called the War Machine, a system of game rules designed to resolve large battles in the D&D game. And it says works with any number of troops. And this is an attempt to get back to D&D's wargaming roots by creating a system that would allow you to play mass battles, armies, that kind of thing, within the D&D scope. That's going to go through all of this to determine like how to run mass combat, right? And then it's going to get into the multiverse. This is another thing that we really hadn't discussed in Dungeons and Dragons up until this point. So you had the planes starting to be discussed. I mean, obviously you knew that there were planes from some of the spells and things that you'd seen in advanced D&D by this time. You were aware that, in the player's handbook, it shows you all the different planes of existence. So we're aware that there are different planes. However, the manual of the planes for how to travel between those planes, so that's not going to come out until 1987. Articles are starting to be written in Dragon Magazine about the planes, but this is the D&D system, and so the planes are different. It has a lot of the same ones, the elemental planes, the ethereal, the astral, the inner planes, that kind of thing. But the presentation is different in here, but it's going to go into this vortices and wormholes and elemental magic and all that kind of stuff, which is kind of cool. Aging constructs, again, demi-human crafts and things like that. And then you have your charts for attack rolls, and then you've got new treasures and you have new monsters. So this is where we're going to see the beholder show up in this version of the game. And this is a pretty long monster section. It's pretty cool, but it's pretty long. And then you have, your treasure tables and all new treasures being added to here. So nothing that you wouldn't necessarily not expect, but it's pretty detailed. Okay. And then you're going to get into a short little adventure called the Golden Dagger. And so you're going to have Count Sir James, and he's got 5 knights, and each knight's squire, and then there's men at arms, and so you're having a big party of people. So you have the Golden Dagger, you have the Arena of Gerald the Blue, the Fall of the Black Eagle. So it gives you sort of a setting and a situation, like something that you need to figure out. These are very short little things here. It gives you a blank page of hex paper that you can use for making maps. And then we see our epilogue here, and then we have our ads for the Marvel Superheroes role-playing game, Star Frontiers, Dragon Magazine, and Amazing Stories. Of those, the only one I never got was Amazing Stories. I was aware it existed. I just, at the time, wasn't interested. But I got all of those other ones. And then we have our index here in the back. Now let's briefly go over the master set. This, to me, is probably one of the weakest sets in this 5-box set thing, because it's essentially just exaggerating what we just saw in the companion set. And it makes the characters kind of ridiculous. I personally never knew any characters that actually adventured up to this level. I'm sure some of you may have known some, but I just don't really feel like it adds a whole lot. But it's going to go into like the ultimate game and advancing to 36 level, which is the highest level that you can advance to. So it's going to tell us that that's as far as you can go. And so it's going to expand everything to get to 36 levels. So here's our cleric and all new spells that you can have. You have your new druid spells as well. And then you have magic users and fighters and new magic user spells. And then you've got your thief experience table. So now we can see this is the full outline of thief progression and skills. And what you'll notice is that once you get up to level around 25, 26, most of these skills are going to are going to surpass 100 if they haven't already. Okay. And that I think is really interesting. And then basically what it says is that, like, for example, at 36 level, your open locks percentage is 120%. And it says, well, you might have a really difficult lock or a stuck lock, and in which case the dungeon master can then apply a penalty to your roll, but you still have that 120. So like maybe you take maybe the lock is so hard that it gives you a 5, 10, or 20% penalty, but your score is 120, so you're still going to open the lock. But so it becomes moot, is what I'm saying, is like these skills, I think, unless you're applying like a 50% penalty for a really super hard lock. But in that case, then you're just doing that not to test rolls, that you're doing it for a story reason, I would guess. Okay, and then again, we have our demi-human attack ranks for higher levels of experience. So it goes from A through M. All right, and halflings are the only ones that have A and B, and then dwarves and elves start at attack rank C, and they can go up through M. Halflings can only go up through K. But basically, these attack ranks, again, is just when you're rolling on the tables. It gives the it gives a similarity of having gained levels, so that you're getting better at your attacks. This is the classic picture from this one. This is by Jeff Easley. This I'm guessing this is an elf here, and then the dwarf and the halfling, but like much higher levels. Okay, so here's your hit roll charts over here. You have new armor and weapons, and talks about all that kind of thing. And then we're going to get into weapon mastery, which is a thing a lot of people kind of complain about. But the short version is, instead of knowing all the weapons that you're able to use, you can decide to limit the number of weapons that you learn, but then you are better at using those weapons. This is going to be the start of a long history of trying to give, especially fighters, more things to do. And in this case, giving them bonuses to use their weapons, like a limited list of weapons. And then it's going to get into detailed weapons and adding new weapons, and using clubs as a torch and all this kind of stuff. And you have all your pole arms listed here. Okay, and you have much more charts. You've got special effects. You have item and NPC specialist descriptions, siege weapons, artillery, fortifications, all these different things for siege towers and how to hold a siege. And then we're going to get into expanded war machine rules that we had first seen before in the companion set. It's going to expand them here. And then he's going to have a little afterword. And then we're going to get into the DM's book. So he basically says there's so much to fit into the DM's book that the player's book is very short. The player's book is only going to be like 34 pages, 32. And then we're going to get into the DM's book. And this one's, I mean, it's pretty interesting. It talks about anti-magic effects and characters sort of becoming immune to certain magic the higher levels that they go, which again starts to make some magical spells moot. which I think it just stops being fun at a certain point to me if your character can't be affected by anything. It talks about your Dominion income and your XP and your different kinds of encounters. Trying to challenge characters of this level can be very, very difficult. Revised experience points values for calculating experience for killing monsters. And then it talks about immortals, and it basically says like this set is the transition one to start saying like as your characters hit like get close to that 36th level, they're going to realize they're going to top out, but then they become aware that they could become an immortal. All immortals once started out as mortals in this game. There are no gods in the world of Mystera, which is the setting for the basic D&D system. So this starts to really tie the set of rules to a specific system, because if you're homebrewing and don't have immortals, then the immortals rules are irrelevant, and that also means about half of this master set is irrelevant as well, because it's talking about how to start on the path to becoming an immortal. So there are different spheres of power. There's the sphere of matter, energy, there's time, there's thought, and there's entropy. And they all have different approaches to become immortals, following one of those different spheres of power. So, and then you have to petition to become one, and then it gives you the 4 paths: dynasts, epicuros, paragons, and polymaths. And then we're going to get intelligence for different creatures, and then a list of all the different creatures. And then it's going to introduce a class called mystics. I don't know why they were in here, except that they're NPCs. So you're not going to let a player character play this, I guess. I'm not sure why. But the Mystic is the basic D&D version, or the BECMI D&D version of the monk from Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. They're martial artists. And so there's going to be a whole section here on martial arts within the game. And then it talks about things like reality shifts and record keeping. And, so things that you would have to deal with high-level play. I just think it's just not, for me, it's just not quite as fun. So monsters are going to include things like the undead beholder, as an example. There's new dinosaurs introduced in here. They have some more info on dragons, like dragon rulers: pearl, opal, diamond, the great dragon. So the opal dragon is the sun dragon, ruler of all neutral dragons. Pearl is the moon dragon, ruler of all chaotic dragons. And then diamond is the star dragon, ruler of all lawful dragons. And then the great dragon is the ruler of all dragons. All of them. So again, different from the presentation that we see in Advanced D&D, but it's following the same path. There's like one powerful dragon for each alignment, like you have Tiamat and Bahamut in Advanced D&D. Okay, so you have all those different ones. Just continued adding new monsters in here. Sphinxes. You have a monster list for monsters on the other planes, elemental rulers, and phoenixes. And is phoenixes the plural of phoenix? I don't know. It's whatever. And then you have other monsters, acolytes to zombie minotaurs, are all going to be in here. And then we're going to introduce artifacts in this system. So very much like what we've seen in AD&D. So that is one of the things that I think starts to become pretty clear here, is that Frank Mentzer is drawing on a lot of the things that we've seen presented already in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and figuring out how to represent it in a way that is consistent with the rules for the BECMI edition. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that necessarily, but then it stops making the BECMI edition seem kind of like its own thing, because it seems like it's starting to kind of copy what we've seen in Advanced D&D. It hasn't copied the artifacts, but just having them, I think, is kind of, shows that it's looking to AD&D for inspiration. Just put it that way. And so that is going to be the look at the Masters set. Okay, and this is the last of the 5 BECMI sets. This is the Immortals set. This is our Player's Guide to Immortals. And again, we're sticking with the Elmore art for the cover. And probably not my favorite of the 5. In fact, I would say it's probably my least favorite. We didn't really go too much over the Masters cover here that you see. There's looks like a king or an emperor in gold armor riding on a gold dragon. I'm saying it's a gold dragon. But here on the Immortals set, we have this sort of godlike figure in like a loincloth, shooting some kind of power out of his hand. And then there's like a red dragon behind him. I don't know that this necessarily conveys what's going on in here, but I don't know what would have been better, I guess. So this is really interesting because this is the first time that we've really seen in Dungeons and Dragons a example of how a character can transcend levels and mortality and become like gods. Now, like I said, these are immortals are not gods in Mistra or in BECMI edition. They're technically different, even though mechanically I think there's a lot of similarities. But they were very careful to not call them gods. They called them immortals. There was a little bit of discussion in the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Deities and Demigods hardback that talked about the idea that characters might be able to become gods one day. And in fact, in Gary Gygax's Greyhawk campaign specifically, some of the gods like Merlin, who, if memory serves, Merlin was Don Kay's character, Gary Gygax's childhood friend. Or I don't know if they were childhood friends, but they were definitely friends. Don Kay was one of the original people that helped Gary start Tactical Studies Rules to publish Dungeons and Dragons, and then died very, very young. I think he was only 36 years old. And Merlin, I believe, was Don Kay's character, and Merlin became, and again, if memory serves, what was known as a quasi-deity, which is like a step below a demigod, but not quite. And so I think that was partly Gary's homage to Don Kay. But this is a system for any player character to kind of transcend those levels and become immortals. So this is published in 1986. And again, it's going to be the last in the line of this group. So again, the player's guide is just going to explain to you how to do this, the transition from your regular levels to immortals. And essentially what you're going to do, this is a very, very quick snapshot. You're going to convert your experience points into something called power points. And then you spend those power points on different abilities. Okay. And so you're no longer really gaining levels. So all the things that are associated with levels that you needed to know before, you don't need that now. And that's why you're going to convert those to power points to buy these powers. And then you're going to have ranks and levels, and it's going to talk about that. The race of the character is the same as in mortal life. A mortal race has long been a major factor in a character's personality and will always be visible in some way to those who have the ability to see it, such as other mortals, as an emanation of the life force. The title immortal is not the same of a race or class. It is a new type of life form and a new state of mind. So you've left all of your class abilities and your racial abilities and all that stuff behind if you become an immortal. And that's just telling you how it affects everything: alignment, armor class, hit dice, hit points, movement, ability scores. All these kinds of things are going to be different as you're becoming an immortal. And it's different to the point, I need to grab my book here, that Lawrence Schick, who writes a book in 1991 called Heroic Worlds, A History and Guide to Role-Playing Games. So the way he describes this set, it's on page 133. He says, rules for character levels beyond 36. Immortality. Characters trade in their experience points for power points that are expended on new abilities. The rules cover transhuman immortal characters, their powers, avatars, artifacts, relationships with other immortals, and ability to create personal home planes. It includes new powerful monsters and scenario suggestions. Okay, now this is the big quote. Play using the Immortals rules is so different from low-level D&D as to be almost another game entirely. And I think that's very, very true. So this is the one box that I probably have the least experience with of these four. Not probably, it is the one that I have the least experience with. And it to me, honestly, it just didn't seem fun. I never had a desire for my character to become something like this. Like, I liked adventuring and doing things that I could relate to more as a person, living on Earth and knowing that there are heroes that actually like do things, to help people or accomplish tasks or like whatever it is. And the Immortals thing just seemed like so removed from all of that. It was a little hard to kind of, at least for me, wrap my head around like what's the point of this and why would I want to do it? But it talks all about like defense and repair and anti-magic and physical recovery, because you don't really have a body anymore, so you're not healing. That's why it says repair. Okay. And having a bias in the relations between immortals and three-dimensional movement. I mean, I think you can get the point why Lawrence Schick said it's like playing an entirely different game. Combat is completely different. Power attacks. All characters have these like super powerful abilities. So they start to become a little bit the same, at least to me. Um, so that's basically that's what you're seeing here in your player's guide. You have your reference tables and saving throws, and then you get it to your DM's guide, which is going to explain the multiverse again and the planes of existence, the prime material plane, the different dimensions, the secrets of the multiverse. And then we have our diagrams here of the outer planes. It says exists in many shapes and sizes, which is kind of fun. And then you have the astral and ethereal planes. And then you have your prime plane, which is the universe, and then your 4 elemental planes surrounding it, and wormholes going in between. And so then it's going to get into details for the different planes and the how to like what's found there. So like encounters in the astral plane, for example, or in the different outer planes, and like what you might find there. And just continues on. So that's a huge part of this part of the book, is talking about the multiverse. And then it's going to get into campaigns and essentially like ideas for like what can you do? How would you adventure as an immortal? And XP awards and penalties if you have both mortals and immortals in the same group. How do you run a group like that? And then it says games for immortals only, and these are things that you might want to do. Exploration. Both mortals and immortals often explore the prime and outer planes, but rarely together. Investigation, and talks about investigate an enemy outpost or recover ruins, destroy an ancient evil. And then it talks about immortal justice. There's new magic, which works differently. There's like the magic of time, defeat energy, move or change water, create or change time. These are all like abilities that you can do. And then it talks about like creating your home plane. And then you've got your sphere of entropy, which just wants to see all the other spheres destroyed. And so what are the immortals like who are part of that sphere? Like that was their path to immortality, was the sphere of entropy, and like what does that mean? And then again, it just talks about like planning adventures, how to do this for immortal type characters. Now, I think this is interesting. We're going to start to get into some, I guess they call them creatures, instead of monsters. But you're going to see archons, which are lawful champions of goodness and sworn enemies of chaos. But you're also going to see demons in here. And what's interesting, at least to me, is that the demons that we're going to start seeing appear in here are ones that we saw originally in Supplement 3 Eldritch Wizardry. So it's going to bring in like Orcus. But I do think it's interesting and fun that we have these demons that we've seen before that are now coming into this edition. And it's going to go on and on. Diabolus, dragon rulers, elemental creatures, nightmare creatures, which are kind of fun in concept, at least, maybe not necessarily in execution. Then it's going to give us a list of source materials. So chainmail, swords and spells, which is interesting that they're listing these source materials. I guess it's things that Frank Mentzer looked at, but a lot of these at this point would have been out of print for a while, so the average person wouldn't be able to go like find them. But lists all 4 of the supplements for original D&D, Greyhawk, Blackmoor, Eldritch Wizardry, and Gods, Demigods, and Heroes. Then he lists both basic sets of Dungeons and Dragons, the one edited by Eric Holmes and the one edited by Tom Moldvay. And then he's got additional references, and this is where he goes beyond D&D sources to look at books of mythology and the Book of Imaginary Beings and Bullfinch's mythology, things like that. So this is kind of cool to have in there. Inspirational reading. It's just going to list authors, not books, and it's a pretty long list. It's all the ones that you would think of, but it probably goes beyond that. I'll just put it that way, and you can see the list here. It's over on the left-hand side. And then you have your reference guide for all these different charts, kind of all collapsed into one place where you can find them. And that's really going to wrap up the Immortals set. You have our character sheet here on the backside. Now, this is 1986. This is the last box set that's going to be released specifically for BECMI. Then what's going to happen is in 1991, TSR is going to release 2 products for this line. So the first, I don't know what order they were produced in, and they might have come out at the same time. But one is what people now refer to as the black box, which gets confusing because some people call the Masters set from BECMI the black box. But there is a set of D&D called the black box. It was called the easy to master version, but colloquially people refer to it as the black box. This is an introductory set to Dungeons and Dragons, but it's this version. It's the BECMI version, but it's covering levels 1 through 5. And they introduced like a card mechanic to help explain some of the rules in there, which a lot of people thought was kind of cool. A few people have asked me to cover that set, and I might get to it eventually. I just feel like, other than the cards, it's not really offering anything new and different than what was in BECMI, at least to my understanding. And again, I never played that edition, so. But it came in a bigger box. The box was, it was landscape instead of portrait. So it's a little bit of a different presentation. Now, the other thing that's going to come out in 1991 is the Rules Cyclopedia. I think of the two, this is the bigger of the two products. The Rules Cyclopedia is going to take the rules from the Basic, Expert, Companion, and Masters rules from BECMI and put it all in one book. So it's not going to have the Immortals rules in there, but it's going to have everything else in one book, represented in a different way. It does make a few minor tweaks to the rules, but nothing really egregious. And it's sort of like the one-stop shop. So it is, at that point in time, the only version of D&D that you could get in just one book. All you needed was one hardback book, and it had everything you needed. It had how to create a character, how to run the game, combat, monsters, treasure, spells, all in a single volume of book covering levels 1 through 36. It was a huge deal for a lot of people. That's their desert island D&D, people that started out back around the time that I did. So, I never picked up the Rules Cyclopedia. I kind of regret that now, because it would be something nice to have as a reference book. But again, I know that it's something that a lot of people are very fond of, because the fact that it contains everything in one book. Now, it's either 94 or 95. I'll clarify it up here on the screen. TSR is going to release the last non-advanced version of the game, pretty much ever. And that's going to be the classic D&D game. Now, I used to have the player's guide to that game. However, I did it I gave it away as a giveaway when I reached 1,000 subscribers on the channel, and that was a long time ago. That was in May of 2023, and somebody won that. And so I no longer have it, and which is fine, because it wasn't mine original. It's like I had picked it up actually at a used bookstore, but it's called Classic D&D, and it is essentially a repackaging of these rules again, but not changing anything mechanically. It's just new art, new box set, that kind of thing. And that's all in one set. And then that's going to be it. So that's like 90, like I said, 94 and 95. And then TSR is going to be on dire straits. It was already kind of heading that way. And they are about ready to go completely under when they are acquired by Wizards of the Coast in 97. They are going to keep publishing materials under the TSR logo for the next 2 years. And then in the year 2000, I was going to sing it like, in the old Conan O'Brien, in the year 2000, there was that comedy bit. But anyway, I don't sing very well. But they're going to release the 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons. And that's the point at which there's no longer a separate, 2 concurrent editions of D&D. They're going to drop the advanced descriptor, and they're just going to call the game Dungeons and Dragons. And that was the end of the 2 different editions and the sort of the basic line. Okay, so that is kind of the history and the aftermath of this particular set. So again, I would love to hear from folks, especially if you played like with the Masters or Immortals rules, because I've never met anybody who really did. Just for me personally, I know a ton of people did. Nobody that I ever gamed with. I think it's no secret, as I've talked before, that I prefer playing with lower level characters, but it's something that I think a lot of people like the higher level stuff, and I'd love to hear that. But I do think that there were some interesting things coming out of this edition. It's less to me about mechanics, although the mechanics I think are cool in the companion set for like the domain level play, and I guess some of the stuff in the master set, but for me, like the basic and expert sets of BECMI don't really add anything new that I think was missing from the Moldvay set. I do think, however, it is sort of a masterclass in a small operation transitioning into more of a trying to look good for investors and the public and things like that, of transitioning out of these war game roots and sort of this like DIY, do it yourself, scrappy company that was like, putting things together on the fly and like coming up with this consistent trade dress. So it's packaging. It's also pedagogy. It's like teaching. Okay. Like how do we convey the information to people in the clearest way possible to teach people how to play this game? So that is one thing that Frank Mentzer did kind of start from scratch with this. While he doesn't change the mechanics, he did have to come up with a complete, well, he didn't have to, he chose to come up with a completely new way to explain how to play the game to people in his sets here. And I think that is really interesting. And then also the idea of player retention, keeping people involved in the game, means that you have these different box sets that are bringing you up in level. And as you move up in level, you're going to want to get that next box set because you're like, oh, I'm at level 22, 23. I'm getting close to 25. And then my companion set's going to run out. I need that master set so I can move up. And then the fact that they're scaling these as they come out year after year gives people time to get to that point. Now, part of that is just Frank is writing as he went along, I believe. But I think that was brilliant to have these sets come out in order over time, over a 3-year time span, to grow with people as their characters are becoming higher level within the system. So I think that's some really cool stuff that came out of this edition. But again, it's not one that I ever really spent any time with. So, by the time we got to 1983, I was whole on into playing first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and I didn't think I had time for anything that was non-advanced. The only part from this BECMI line or BECMI edition that I really got into were the Gazetteers. And I have talked about those before when I talked about the campaign setting of Mistra before. So you can see that video if you want to learn more about that. But that is going to be my wrap up here for the BECMI edition. So once again, I would love to hear from people with your experiences with this edition. Let me know if there was a part of it that you really thought was cool that I missed. And in particular, I'd love to hear from folks that are really enamored with the Masters or Immortals sets. And let me know what I'm missing. What am I not seeing that made those so cool to you? And, just be cool about it. Be respectful about it. I'm very open to the idea. I didn't play with these, so I don't have that nostalgia that like some of you might. So I might just be looking at it with a completely different set of eyes, but I would like to hear your thoughts on that. And so please leave those thoughts in the comments below. And then, of course, while you're down there, you'll find places to join me on social media. You'll find places where you can follow my blog. That is going to wrap this up. So with that, I would like to say thank you so very much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I will talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking and what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. So once again, a lot of notes because 5 different box sets, none of which I've ever owned before. I was familiar with them a little bit, but again, it took a while. And so I want some kind of nice, easy drink. It's also getting warmer here, finally. We had a lot of a very cool, for Southern California, a cool April and May, which I don't mind. I don't mind cool weather, but it was also just super overcast and I was hoping for some sun. Finally, the sun started to come out. It's got a little bit warmer. So this is just a simple highball. Again, a highball is just a spirit mixed with some kind of lengthener. In this case, I'm using, this is some sparkling grapefruit water. So it's just sparkling water, grapefruit flavor. So it's not a grapefruit soda, has no added sugar or anything. It's just grapefruit flavored sparkling water. This particular one is by Sanzo, I guess. I don't know. My wife picked it up. But I mixed it with a little bit of mezcal. So mezcal doesn't have to, but often has like a smoky characteristic. It also be fruity. But smoke and grapefruit are 2 flavors that actually go together very, very well. So that's why you'll see like there's a classic cocktail. So there's a Paloma, classic Mexican cocktail of tequila mixed with grapefruit soda, sometimes has a little lime or maybe some salt or something. I quite like them. And so this is, kind of in a similar vein, but that's why they do that. So tequila also can have some smoky characteristics, right? And so just because of the way that it's prepared. So anyway, this is just a simple, easy drinking, summery, late spring, I guess it's not quite summer yet, drink. Okay. So yeah, that's very refreshing. It's mostly the water. I just put like not even a full measure of the mezcal in there. I used Illegal brand just because I know the sales are up because he visits my local pub from time to time. Okay, so then what was I listening to? Well, we lost 2 important musicians just in the past couple of days. It's been pretty rough. So Sly Stone from Sly and the Family Stone, and I did listened actually to this exact album before on the channel. It was one of the very first times that I did a drinking and listening. So I think it was like the fifth or sixth time. So I have featured this before, but I just wanted to show it again to honor Sly Stone. He's a very important musician in American music. But obviously Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys. And my dad, I guess, we didn't really talk about too much. He was a big Beach Boys fan. I mean, I knew that. It was just like, I guess we didn't really share that because it's just not my style. But my dad was really into it, much more so than the Beatles. So my dad had a few Beach Boys albums in his collection. And so I brought them all out. I don't necessarily say I have a particular favorite. What I would love to have Pet Sounds that of any Beach Boys album, that would be the one that I think I would most resonate with. I've just been waiting to find like a good copy in the wild that wasn't like horribly expensive. And that's the only reason I don't have it yet. I do like their Christmas record. I'm not going to lie. So I'm a holiday music fan, a Christmas music fan. And so I do like that one. And I do own that on vinyl. But these are just, like I said, a selection of Beach Boys albums that my dad had, that we, when we cleaned out his apartment after he passed away. And so I grabbed these off the shelf and just, was kind of spinning them a little bit. You guys know I prefer instrumental music when I'm making my videos or making my notes because it's easier for me to focus. But these are songs that I've heard enough that like they kind of, I could hear it without being distracted by it. So I'm glad that my dad had these. It's fun to have. And these are all original back from the 60s. So they're not all first pressings. They're not really worth all that much. They pressed a lot of these back in the day. So, but I take care of them obviously. And I'm happy to have them. And so let me know if you have a favorite Beach Boys album in the comments, and what you thought about the passing of Brian Wilson, and if you also did a tribute by listening to some of his albums, and also Sly Stone. I mean, let's not forget Sly and the Family Stone. So, have you ever listened to any of that before? I'd say of the two, probably people are less familiar with Sly Stone, but it is honestly more of my jam. I prefer kind of like funky soul music than like surf music. It's just me and my preference, but that doesn't mean I don't appreciate the legacy of Brian Wilson and what he brought to the music world, especially Pet Sounds and how that changed the course of music during that time period, which had an impact that lasted for decades. So that's going to be it for this video. Thank you so very much for watching. Cheers, and I will talk to you next time.